The loom shuddered beneath her fingers, and a thread snapped against her wrist hard enough to raise a welt. Elara pressed the heel of her hand against the sting and kept working. The funeral shroud had to be finished before dawn, before the Alpha King's body cooled on the stone slab in the great hall 3 floors below, and her hands were already cramping from 16 hours of continuous weaving. Except the Alpha King was not dead yet. She could still feel his heartbeat through the castle walls, faint and stubborn, like a fist knocking on a door that everyone else had already locked. The royal physicians had declared him gone by sunset. The Council of Elders had begun dividing his territories before the candles burned down to their nubs. And the head weaver old Maran had shoved Elara into the tower workroom with 6 pounds of undyed mourning silk and instructions to produce a king's burial shroud by first light. That was the job. Elara was the night weaver, the one they sent for when the work was ugly or thankless, or needed doing at hours when decent wolves were sleeping. She had held this position in the Ashenmoor pack for 3 years, ever since she aged out of the orphan hall at 17 and had to justify her continued existence. She was not a warrior. She was not a healer. Her wolf had never surfaced, not once, and in a pack where your wolf determined your worth, having no wolf was the same as having no soul. The tower room smelled of lanolin and cold stone, and the sharp green bite of the juniper oil she used to keep the moths from eating through the silk stores. Her breath came out in small white clouds. The fire had died 2 hours ago, and nobody would bring more wood for the Omega Weaver working through the night on a dead king's cloth. Not dead, she reminded herself. Not yet. She did not know why she could feel it. She had never met Alpha King Theron of the Ironhold pack. He had arrived at Ashenmoor 3 days ago, for the treaty summit collapsed during the first night's feast with what the healers called shadow venom, and had been dying slowly ever since. His own warriors, the massive scarred wolves who had accompanied him, stood vigil outside his chamber, with faces like granite cliffs. The Ashenmoor wolves whispered that it was an assassination, that someone at the feast had poisoned the most powerful alpha on the continent, that whoever had done it was probably still inside the castle walls. None of this concerned Elara. She was a weaver. She wove. But his heartbeat thudded against her sternum like a second pulse, and every time it stuttered, her fingers faltered on the loom. She had tried to ignore it since the moment his entourage rode through the front gates. She had been carrying a bolt of finished linen across the courtyard, her arms aching, her hair tied back with a strip of scrap fabric, and she had looked up as the horses thundered past and something inside her chest had cracked open like an egg against the edge of a bowl. She had dropped the linen in the mud. Maran had struck her across the ear for it, and Elara had spent the next 3 days telling herself it was nothing, just the shock of seeing so many unfamiliar wolves, just the cold air catching in her lungs. It was not nothing. She knew what it was. She had read every book in the pack's small library during those long orphan hall years when the other children were out learning to shift and run and hunt. She knew the old texts described the mate bond as a thread pulled taut between 2 souls, and she had always thought that was a metaphor. It was not a metaphor. It was a physical sensation, a wire strung from her breastbone to his, and right now it was vibrating with the frequency of a dying man's heart. The shroud grew beneath her hands, ivory silk close woven, dense enough to hold its shape when draped over a body. She wove it the way Maran had taught her, with the traditional mourning pattern, the interconnected spirals that symbolized a wolf's spirit returning to the moon. But her hands kept doing something else, something she could not quite control. Small deviations in the pattern, places where the spirals broke apart and reformed into shapes she did not recognize. She told herself it was exhaustion. She told herself her cramping fingers were slipping. But the cloth was warm under her hands, warmer than it should have been, warmer than the freezing tower room could account for, and in the places where the pattern shifted, the silk seemed to glow with a faint opalescence, like moonlight trapped in water. She was so focused on the loom that she didn't hear the door open. What she heard was the breathing. Ragged wet labored like someone pulling air through a collapsed tunnel, and beneath it that heartbeat, suddenly so loud and so close that her own heart seized in her chest and she gasped and spun on her stool. He filled the doorway. Alpha King Theron of the Ironhold Pack was supposed to be on his deathbed, 3 floors below, surrounded by physicians and warriors, and the flickering light of ceremonial candles. He was not. He was standing in the doorway of her tower workroom, one hand braced against the stone frame, his body listing to the side like a ship taking on water. He wore nothing but the thin linen sleeping shift they had dressed him in for his dying, and it was soaked through with sweat, clinging to a body that was enormous, even in its diminished state. His skin had the greyish pallor of someone the poison had nearly finished. His dark hair hung in damp ropes across his forehead. His eyes were closed, but he was standing, and he was breathing, and his heartbeat, the one she had felt through stone and timber and 3 floors of castle, was hammering so hard she could see the pulse jumping in his throat. Elara did not move. She did not breathe. She sat on her wooden stool in front of her loom, with a half-finished funeral shroud spilling across her lap, and she watched the most powerful alpha on the continent sway in her doorway like a man sleepwalking through his own death. His nostrils flared. Even from across the room she saw it. The way his chest expanded, the way his head turned, tracking something in the air the way a wolf tracks prey. His lips parted. His jaw tightened. And then his eyes opened. They were amber. Not brown, not hazel, but true amber, the color of pine resin held up to firelight, and they locked onto her with a focus that should have been impossible for a man with shadow venom, dissolving his organs from the inside out. The room was dark. The only light came from the single tallow candle on her workbench and the strange pale glow of the shroud on her loom. But his eyes found her instantly, unerringly, the way a compass needle finds north. He said one word. "Mate." His voice was destroyed. It came out as a rasp, barely audible, scraped raw by whatever the venom had done to his throat. But the word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, and Elara felt the ripples move through her body, through her blood, through the thing in her chest that had been vibrating since the moment he rode through the gates. She should have spoken. She should have called for help, for his warriors, for the physicians. He was dying. He was poisoned. He had somehow dragged himself up 3 flights of narrow tower stairs in the dark while his body was shutting down, and he was going to collapse and die on her workroom floor, and they were going to blame her for it. Instead, she whispered, "You should be in bed." His mouth twitched. It might have been a smile, or it might have been a grimace of pain. He took 1 step forward. His knee buckled. He caught himself on the edge of her workbench, sending the tallow candle skidding, and the shadows in the room lurched and swung. Elara was off her stool before she made the conscious decision to move. She was small, barely 5'3", and he was a mountain of a man, even hollowed out by poison, but she got her shoulder under his arm and braced her legs, and took his weight with a strength that surprised them both. He smelled like fever sweat and something underneath it, something deep and ancient and green like cedar sap and wet earth after rain, and the sharp mineral edge of river stones. The mate bond surged through her like an electrical current, and for one disorienting moment, She could feel what he was feeling, the venom eating through his veins like acid, the cold spreading through his limbs, and beneath all of it, a desperate animal relief, as if his wolf had been searching for something for a very long time and had finally found it. "You are an idiot," she told him, struggling to guide him toward the only other piece of furniture in the room, the narrow cot where she sometimes slept during long commissions. "You are a dying idiot." "Not dying," he said. His arm tightened around her shoulders. His hand found the back of her neck, and his fingers pressed against the bare skin. There, and the place where he touched her, went hot, searingly hot, as if his palm were a brand. "Not any more." She got him onto the cot. It groaned under his weight. He was too long for it, by a foot, his legs hanging off the end, and she had to catch him as he slumped sideways because his body was giving out, even as his eyes stayed fixed on her face with that terrible, unwavering focus. "The shroud," he said. She followed his gaze to the loom, where the half-finished cloth still hung its surface, catching the candlelight with that strange inner luminescence. The shifted patterns, the places where her hands had deviated from the morning spirals, seemed brighter now, more deliberate. Not random errors. Something else. "Give it to me." "It is your funeral shroud," she said. "It is not finished, and you are not dead. Give it to me." She did not know why she obeyed. Later she would tell herself it was because he was the Alpha King, and she was a packless Omega with no wolf and no status and no right to refuse. But that was not why. She obeyed because the bond was a hook in her chest, and when he pulled, she moved. She lifted the cloth from the loom. It was heavier than it should have been, denser, as if the weaving had compressed the silk into something more than fabric. Where the morning pattern held, the cloth was cool ivory. Where the pattern had shifted, it was warm to the touch and faintly iridescent, and the new shapes looked like she squinted in the dim light interlocking wolves, two of them circling each other, their bodies forming a continuous loop with no beginning and no end. The mating spiral. The oldest symbol in wolf lore, older than the morning pattern, older than the pack system itself. She had not consciously woven it. She did not even know how she knew what it looked like. Theron reached for the cloth. His hand was trembling, his fingers grey at the tips from poor circulation, but when his skin touched the fabric, the glow intensified. The warmth spread visibly up his arm, and she watched the grey recede from his fingertips, watched colour flood back into his hand, his wrist, his forearm, as if the cloth were pushing the poison back. "What is this?" she breathed. He pulled the shroud across his chest like a cloak, dragging it over his shoulders, wrapping it around his body. Where the fabric settled against his skin, the sweat dried. The trembling stilled. The deathly pallor that had made him look like a corpse, pulled vertical, began to fade, replaced by the deep olive tone of living skin of blood moving properly through veins that the venom had been collapsing. "This is a mating cloth," he said, and his voice was already stronger, the rasp smoothing into something deep and resonant that she felt in her teeth. "You wove me a mating cloth and called it a funeral shroud. I did not know what I was doing. Your wolf did. I do not have a wolf." He looked at her. The amber eyes were sharper now, clearer, and they moved across her face with an attention that made her feel dissected, examined down to the bone. He took in her thin work dress, the patches at the elbows, the stains on the hem. Her chapped hands with their calluses and small scars from loom accidents. The dark circles under her eyes. The way her collarbone stood out above the neckline of her dress because she had not eaten a full meal in 3 days, not since the kitchen was redirected to serve the summit guests, and the Omegas were told to make do with whatever was left. "Who starves you?" he asked. The question was quiet. It was the quietness that scared her. Not the words themselves, but the absolute controlled stillness with which he asked them, as if the answer would determine whether someone lived or died. "Nobody starves me. I eat what I am given." "And what are you given?" She did not answer. He reached out and took her wrist. His grip was gentle, but she could feel the strength behind it, the restraint. He turned her hand over, palm up, and ran his thumb across the calluses. The healing cut from yesterday, when the reed shuttle had slipped the older scar along the base of her index finger from the time she caught her hand in the warp beam. "These are not the hands of someone who is cared for," he said. "I care for myself. You shouldn't have to." Something was happening inside her. Not just the bond, which was a constant low vibration, now a humming in her bones. Something deeper, something older. A warmth that started in her chest and spread outward, and with it a sensation she had never felt before. A stirring, a stretching, like something waking up after a very long sleep. Her vision blurred. She blinked, and for one fraction of a second, the room looked different. Sharper. The colors more saturated, the shadows more defined. She could see the individual fibers of the mating cloth, could count the threads per inch from across the room. She could smell the juniper oil and the lanolin and the cold stone, and beneath them him cedar and earth and river stone and something else, something warm and alive, and specifically unmistakably hers. Then it was gone, and she was just Elara again, the night weaver, with no wolf standing in a freezing tower room, with the Alpha King wrapped in his own funeral shroud. "I need to call your warriors," she said. "Your physicians. They think you are dead. Let them think it, Your Majesty. Theron, Your Majesty, you were poisoned. You need medical attention. I need you to sit down," he said, "and tell me your name." She sat, not because she wanted to, but because her legs were shaking, and she was suddenly so tired that the stone floor looked inviting. She sat on the edge of the cot as far from him as the narrow frame would allow, and she folded her trembling hands in her lap. "Elara," she said. "Elara." He said it slowly, testing it, and the sound of her name in his ruined voice did something terrible to her composure. "Who are your parents?" "I have none. I was left at the Ashenmoor Orphan Hall as an infant. No note. No name. They called me Elara, because the weaver who found me on the doorstep was reading a book about the moon. No pack. Ashenmoor tolerates me. I work. I am useful enough to keep. Tolerates." He repeated the word like it tasted rotten. "And your wolf, I told you. I do not have one." He was quiet for a long moment. He was studying her again, but differently now, looking at something she could not see, something behind, or beneath, or inside her. And whatever he found there made his expression shift in a way she could not read. "You have a wolf," he said finally. "I can feel her. She is the one who wove the mating pattern into my shroud. She is the one who pulled me up 3 flights of stairs when my body was ready to quit." He paused. "She has been waiting for me." Elara opened her mouth to argue, because arguing was safer than believing, and believing was a luxury she had trained herself out of a long time ago. But before she could speak, there were boots on the stairs. Heavy, fast, many of them. And then the door burst open, and the room was full of warriors. Iron-holed warriors. His warriors. 6 of them armored, armed, and radiating the kind of controlled fury that comes from discovering your king's deathbed empty. They took in the scene in a single sweep. their king upright and wrapped in glowing cloth colour returning to his face, and a small, thin omega weaver sitting on the edge of his cot with her hands folded in her lap, like a child called to the headmistress's office. The largest of them, a red-haired warrior with a scar that bisected his left eyebrow and continued down his cheek, stepped forward, with his hand already moving to his sword. "She has done something to you," the warrior said. "Yes," Theron replied. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, and even from the cot, even wrapped in a funeral shroud, he commanded the room simply by existing in it. "She has saved my life, Ronan, and she is my mate." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Elara could feel it pressing against her skin, could feel 6 pairs of wolf eyes turning on her, with expressions that ranged from shock to suspicion, to something she tentatively identified as horror. "With respect, my king," Ronan said carefully, "you have been poisoned. Shadow venom can cause hallucinations, false bonds, sensory disruption." "Does this look like a hallucination?" Theron lifted the edge of the mating cloth. The twin wolves glowed in the candlelight, unmistakable, the ancient pattern that no one alive knew how to weave because it had not been woven in 400 years. Ronan's face changed. "That is a mooncloth," he said. He said it quietly, as if the words themselves were dangerous, and Elara saw the other warriors shift their hands, moving away from their weapons, their postures changing from aggression to something closer to reverence. "My king, that is a moonweaver's cloth." Elara did not know what a moonweaver was. She was about to find out. The news moved through Ashenmoor Castle like wildfire through dry pine. By dawn, the corridor outside the tower workroom was clogged with wolves, Ironhold and Ashenmoor alike, whispering behind cupped hands and craning their necks to peer through the doorway. Elara had been moved to the king's recovery chamber, not as a prisoner exactly, but not freely either. Ronan posted 2 guards at her door with instructions that were ambiguous enough to be concerning. She sat in a chair by the window and watched the sun come up over the Ashenmoor forest, painting the treetops copper and gold, and she tried to organize the chaos of the last 6 hours into something she could understand. The Alpha King was her mate. Her wolf, the wolf she had been told she did not have, had woven a 400-year-old mating pattern into his funeral shroud. The cloth was healing him, and the word moonweaver was being spoken in the hallways, in tones usually reserved for prayers. Maren found her mid-morning. The head weaver was a broad, hard-faced woman in her 60s who had taught Elara everything she knew about fibre and thread and the mechanics of turning raw material into something useful. She was not unkind. She was not kind either. She was practical, which in a pack like Ashenmoor meant she allocated her limited compassion the way she allocated her limited silk carefully and with an eye toward return on investment. She came into the chamber without knocking and closed the door behind her, and stood there for a moment looking at Elara with an expression that Elara had never seen on her face before. It took her a long moment to identify it as fear. "Tell me what you did," Maren said. "I wove a shroud. The pattern changed." "Patterns do not change by themselves. This one did." Maren crossed to the window and stood beside Elara, close enough that Elara could smell the familiar scents of her wool grease and strong black tea and the mint salve she used on her arthritic hands. The old woman stared out at the forest with her jaw working, as if she were chewing on words she did not want to swallow. "Your mother was a weaver," Maren said. Elara went very still. In 20 years, no one had ever told her anything about her mother. She had asked as a child. She had begged, and she had been told every time that nothing was known, that she had been left on a doorstep, with no identification that her origins were a blank page. "You told me you didn't know who left me." I lied. Maren said it flatly, without apology, in the same tone she used to announce that a shipment of dye had gone bad. "Your mother came to Ashenmoor 20 years ago, pregnant, half dead, from running with no pack marks and no name she would give. She was a weaver, the best I had ever seen. She could do things with thread that had no explanation, make fabrics that healed wounds when pressed against skin, weave patterns that calmed fevers and eased pain. She worked in this very tower for 3 months, and she never told me her real name, and I never asked." Maren paused. She pressed her thumb against the bridge of her nose, in a gesture Elara recognized as the old woman's tell for suppressed emotion. "She died having you. The birth was wrong. Too much blood. The midwife said she had never seen anything like it, as if the baby was pulling the mother's life force into itself. Your mother's last act was to wrap you in a cloth she had woven during her pregnancy. And that cloth—" Maren swallowed. "That cloth had the same patterns, the spiraling wolves, the glow. I had never seen it before, but I knew what it was. Every weaver knows the stories. Moonweaver cloth, the sacred mating fabric of the old wolf queens. Why did you hide this from me?" Maren turned to look at her, and the fear in her eyes was not for herself. Elara understood that suddenly and clearly. Maren was afraid for her. Because the last Moonweaver was hunted down and killed 400 years ago. Because whoever your mother was running from, she ran hard enough to die. Because a wolfless Omega orphan in a minor pack survives. A Moonweaver in any pack is a prize that every alpha on the continent would kill to possess. She reached out and gripped Elara's arm with her arthritic fingers, hard enough to hurt. "And now you have gone and woven a mating cloth for the Alpha King of Ironhold, and every wolf in this castle knows it, and whatever safety your obscurity gave you is gone." Elara stared at the old woman's hand on her arm. The gnarled fingers, the swollen knuckles, the mint salve residue in the creases of her skin. This was the hand that had struck her across the ear 3 days ago for dropping linen in the mud. It was also the hand that had spent 20 years hiding her, keeping her small, keeping her invisible, keeping her in a tower room, weaving night commissions. Because a weaver nobody sees is a weaver. Nobody hunts. "You kept me safe," Elara said. "I kept you alive," Maren corrected. "Safe would have required someone with more power than I have. Safe would have required—" She trailed off her eyes, moving to the door beyond which the murmur of gathered wolves was audible. "Safe would have required exactly the kind of wolf who is currently sitting in the great hall, refusing to eat until someone brings you to him." The great hall of Ashenmoor Castle was a cold, draughty space, built for function rather than grandeur. Rough stone walls, timber beams, black with centuries of hearth smoke, long trestle tables, scarred by generations of knife marks. The hearth fire was large but insufficient, and the perpetual draught from the high windows made the tapestries sway with a slow, ghostly motion. Theron sat at the head table. He had been moved there from his sick room, at his own insistence, dressed in fresh clothing brought by his warriors, though he still wore the mating cloth around his shoulders like a cloak. The glow had dimmed to a subtle shimmer, visible only when the light caught it at certain angles. He looked like a different man from the swaying, grey-skinned figure who had appeared in her doorway hours ago. Still gaunt, still marked by the venom's passage, but upright alert, and radiating an authority that made the Ashenmoor wolves at the lower tables hunch into their food, as if trying to become smaller. Alpha Gregor of Ashenmoor sat to his left. Gregor was a thick-necked florid man who ran his pack the way a mid-level manager runs a branch office, with a careful eye on his own position and a tendency to defer upward when pressed. He was deferring now, his face, a careful mask of hospitality that did not quite conceal the sweat on his upper lip. Ronan stood behind Theron's chair, watching the room with eyes that tracked every movement. The hall went quiet when Elara entered. She was aware with excruciating clarity of every eye turning toward her. She was wearing the same work dress she had worn all night, thin and patched and stained. Her hair was down because she had lost her tie somewhere in the chaos of the morning. She had not eaten. She had not slept. She looked exactly like what she was, a half-starved Omega weaver who had been up all night making a dead man's shroud. She walked the length of the hall with her chin up and her hands at her sides, and her heart beating so hard she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. Theron stood when she reached the head table. The gesture was small, simple, and it detonated like a bomb. Alpha Kings didn't stand for Omegas. Alpha Kings didn't stand for anyone. The sound that moved through the hall was not a gasp, but something lower, a collective intake of breath, a recalibration. "Sit," he said, and pulled out the chair to his right. The Luna's chair. The chair that had been empty at Ashenmoor's table for 6 years, since Gregor's mate had died the most honored position at any Alpha's table. Elara sat. A plate appeared in front of her, within seconds piled with food. Roasted venison root vegetables, gleaming with butter bread, still warm from the ovens. Her stomach cramped at the sight of it. She had been living on the cold porridge and stale bread that was standard Omega fare, and the smell of the venison alone was enough to make her light-headed. "Eat," Theron said. "We need to talk about what happened." "We will talk, after you eat." She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him that she was not a dog to be fed and petted, but the venison smelled like someone's idea of heaven, rich and herbed and glistening, and her hands were shaking with hunger. And when he put a piece of bread directly onto her plate, with his own fingers, she ate it. She ate, and he watched her eat, and in his amber eyes there was something that looked like rage. Not at her. At every day she had gone hungry. At every meal she had been given cold scraps. At every year she had spent in a tower room, weaving through the night for a pack that gave her just enough to survive, and not one crumb more. Gregor cleared his throat. "The council has been discussing the situation," he said. His voice was careful, measured the voice of a man navigating a conversation that could get him killed. The matter of the weaver." "Her name is Elara," Theron said. "The matter of Elara. There are concerns about the nature of what occurred. Some on the council believe the cloth may have been enchanted to create a false bond, as a form of entrapment." Theron turned his head and looked at Gregor. Just looked at him. The silence stretched. Gregor's hand, which had been reaching for his goblet, froze mid-motion. "Your pax Nightweaver," Theron said, "was given my funeral commission. She was told to weave my shroud because you declared me dead, while I was still breathing, while my heart was still beating in my chest. You wrote me off and began dividing my territories before my body was cold." He paused. "And now you are suggesting that the woman who saved my life was trying to trap me." "I am conveying the council's concerns," Gregor said. His forehead was shining. "As a matter of protocol. Here is a concern for your council. Someone at your feast poisoned me. Shadow venom does not appear in food by accident. It has to be refined, concentrated, and introduced within a 6-hour window of preparation. Which means someone in your kitchens, someone under your authority, tried to kill me." Theron's voice did not rise. It dropped, which was worse. "You will find that person. You will bring them to me. And you will do it before I lose my patience, which, given that I am recovering from an assassination attempt, is considerably shorter than usual." Gregor nodded rapidly and excused himself from the table with the haste of a man who has just realized the floor beneath him is thinner than he thought. Ilara had stopped eating. The bread sat in her stomach like a stone. "He is going to blame me," she said quietly. "Or Maren. Someone powerless. Someone expendable." Theron looked at her. "You think he knows who did it?" "I think Gregor is a man who survives by knowing things and pretending not to. 3 days ago, his kitchen staff prepared a feast for the most powerful alpha on the continent, and someone smuggled in a rare poison. Either he knew, or his security is so poor that it might as well be complicity." The corner of Theron's mouth moved. "You see clearly for someone who has been kept in a tower. Towers have windows." They were interrupted by a commotion at the hall entrance. A woman swept in trailing 2 attendants and a cloud of jasmine perfume strong enough to reach the head table from 30 feet away. She was tall, sharp-featured, dressed in dark green velvet that fit her the way armor fits a soldier, and she walked with the particular stride of someone who has spent their life in rooms where people move out of their way. Lyra, Gregor's eldest daughter, the acting lady of Ashenmoor, the woman who had been running the household since her mother's death. Ilara knew her the way prey animals know predators by instinct, by the prickling of the skin on the back of the neck. Lyra had never struck her, never insulted her directly, never done anything so crude as open cruelty. What Lyra did was subtler and more effective. She simply arranged things so that Ilara's life was perpetually, precisely uncomfortable. Reduced rations when supplies were tight because omegas ate last. The coldest room in the tower because night weavers did not need warmth. A work schedule that ensured Ilara was always tired, always hungry, always just barely functional enough to produce the cloth that Ashenmoor sold for profit. Lyra stopped at the head table and dropped into a curtsy that was technically correct and spiritually insolent. "Your Majesty, thank the moon you are recovered. We were all so terribly worried." Her eyes moved to Ilara. They lingered on the venison, the bread, the Luna's chair. "I see you have been keeping interesting company, Lady Lyra," Theron said. "I understand you manage the household." "I do." "Then you manage the kitchens." Something flickered across Lyra's face, fast enough that most people would have missed it. Ilara didn't miss it. She had spent years reading Lyra's face the way sailors read weather, because her survival depended on predicting the woman's moods, and what she saw in that flicker was not guilt. It was calculation. "I oversee the domestic staff, yes, though the feast preparations were handled primarily by the head cook and his assistants. I can arrange for you to question them." "I will question everyone," Theron said, starting with whoever determined the seating arrangements and the order of dishes served. Another flicker. This one Lyra controlled less well. "That would be me," she said. The next 3 days were a siege of a different kind. Theron's warriors locked down Ashenmoor Castle. No one entered or left. The investigation into the poisoning proceeded with the methodical brutality of Ironhold protocol, which involved a great deal of quiet questioning in cold rooms, and an even greater amount of going through kitchen ledgers, supply records and staff schedules with the precision of an audit. Ilara was moved to a chamber adjacent to Theron's, connected by a door he left open at all times. She protested this. She protested it every morning when she woke up in a bed that was wider than her entire tower room, wearing a nightdress made of cotton so fine it felt like water against her skin, surrounded by the scent of cedar and earth and river stone that drifted through the open door and made her wolf the wolf. She was still not entirely convinced existed press against the inside of her ribs with a yearning that was physically painful. "This is not appropriate," she told him on the second morning, standing in the connecting doorway with her arms crossed and her jaw set. "I am not your Luna. I am not your anything. A bond doesn't make a marriage." He was sitting at a desk covered in documents, the mating cloth draped over the back of his chair, and he looked up at her with the patient expression of a man who knows he is going to win the argument and is content to let it take as long as it needs to. "You are right," he said. "A bond does not make a marriage. A bond makes a beginning. The rest is choice." He set down his pen. "I am choosing. You are free to choose differently. And if I choose to leave, then I will open the gates and watch you walk through them, and I will spend the rest of my life knowing that my mate left because I could not convince her to stay." His voice was even matter-of-fact and utterly without manipulation, which was the most manipulative thing about it. "But I will not hold you. A wolf who cages his mate deserves to lose her." She stood in the doorway and hated him a little for being decent. It would have been easier if he had been the brute she expected, the possessive alpha who claimed and collared and controlled. She knew how to survive brutes. She had been surviving them her entire life. She did not know how to survive a man who looked at her as if she had hung the moon and then handed her the key to the door. She did not leave. She told herself it was because the investigation was ongoing and she might be needed for questioning. She told herself it was because Maren was inside the lockdown and she did not want to abandon the old woman. She told herself a dozen practical, sensible things that had nothing to do with the way Theron's scent made her feel like she was standing in a forest after rain, like she was home in a place she had never been. On the third night, she could not sleep. The wolf, her wolf, was restless, pacing inside her, the way a caged animal paces, and the sensation was so unfamiliar and disorienting that she got up and went to the window and pressed her forehead against the cold glass and tried to breathe. Theron appeared in the connecting doorway. He was barefoot, wearing only sleeping trousers, and the scars on his torso were visible in the moonlight. A topographical map of battles survived. 3 parallel claw marks across his ribs. A puckered stab wound below his left collarbone. The faded tracery of what looked like a whip across his shoulders. "She's trying to surface," he said. "I know. It will hurt. I know that too." He crossed to her. He moved carefully, giving her space, telegraphing every step the way you approach a skittish animal, and when he reached her, he did not touch her. He stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, and he waited. "I am afraid," she said. It cost her something to say it. She had spent 20 years being afraid, and never once admitting it, and the words tasted strange in her mouth, metallic like blood. "I know," he said. "I was afraid when I surfaced for the first time, too. You were probably 8 years old, surrounded by family, with a pack cheering you on. I was 6. My father held me down during the shift because I was screaming so hard. The healers thought I would bite through my own tongue. My wolf came out fighting. He broke my father's wrist." A pause. "It is not always a gentle thing, meeting yourself." She almost smiled. "You broke your father's wrist." He was very proud. He said it was the first sign that I would be a strong alpha. Another pause. He was wrong about many things. He was right about that. They stood together at the window, not touching, watching the moon arc across the sky above the dark mass of the ashen moor forest. Below the castle was quiet. The investigation had produced results that afternoon, and the results were worse than anyone had anticipated. The shadow venom had been purchased from a black market supplier 3 months before the summit. The purchase had been traced through a series of intermediaries to a single name in the Ashenmore financial ledgers, carefully disguised, buried in a line item for imported spices. The name attached to the account was not Gregor's, it was not Lyra's, it was Ilara's, or rather it was the name on the orphan registry that corresponded to her bed in the hall, a name she had never used, had never even known existed, because orphan hall residents were tracked by number not by name, and the name in the registry Maren had confirmed with white-faced horror had been entered 20 years ago by the woman who had left a baby on the doorstep of the Ashenmore Weavers' Hall. Someone had used her dead mother's alias to buy the poison. Theron received this information without visible reaction. He read the report. He set it down. He looked at Ronan, and he said, "Find me who accessed that account." "The access logs show a single user," Ronan said. "Lady Lyra's household steward, acting on orders that were relayed verbally. The steward has been questioned. He maintains that the orders came from Lady Lyra herself, though he cannot produce written evidence. And Lady Lyra denies everything. She claims the steward acted independently, that she has no knowledge of the account, and that the entire affair is an attempt by the Omega Weaver to frame a noble house." Theron looked at Ilara. She was sitting very still, her hands folded, her face blank in the way it went blank when she was processing something too large for immediate reaction. "She tried to kill you," Ilara said, "and she set it up to look like I did it." "Yes. Why? Because an Alpha King dying at a summit throws the power balance. Ashenmore could have claimed innocence, absorbed Ironhold's border territories in the chaos, and elevated their position from minor pack to major player. And if the poison was traced, it would trace to a wolfless Omega orphan with no allies and no defense." He said this calmly, laying out the political logic the way you lay out a chess problem. "You were the perfect scapegoat. No pack, no family, no one to protest." Maren would have protested and been ignored. Ilara closed her eyes. She thought about Lyra arranging things, the work schedules, the cold room, the reduced rations. She thought about Lyra managing the household, managing the kitchens, managing the quiet, efficient machinery of a domestic empire where every servant was a tool and every Omega was disposable. She thought about Lyra looking at her across the great hall with that calculating flicker, and she understood suddenly that Lyra had been managing her too, keeping her alive because a living scapegoat is more useful than a dead one, keeping her thin and tired and desperate because desperate people do not ask questions. "I want to see her," Ilara said. Theron studied her. "Why?" "Because I have spent 3 years in her household, and I have never once spoken to her as anything other than a servant. I want to speak to her now." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. Lyra was brought to the small council chamber under guard. She came willingly with the erect posture and steady gaze of a woman who has decided that dignity is her last available weapon. Her jasmine perfume preceded her, but fainter now, as if the supply were running low and she was rationing it. She sat in the chair opposite Ilara. Theron stood by the window, arms crossed, watching. Ronan stood by the door. The room was small and stone-walled, and lit by 2 oil lamps that cast the kind of warm, intimate light that made it impossible to hide behind expressions. "You bought the poison under my mother's name," Ilara said. Lyra's chin lifted fractionally. "I do not know your mother's name." "No, but you knew about the account. Maren told me that the registration was unusual, that someone of influence had to have facilitated it." An unnamed woman with no pack marks does not simply appear in the Ashenmore financial registry. Someone vouched for her. Someone with household authority. My mother was the Lady of Ashenmore at that time. If anyone facilitated your mother's registration, it would have been her. Your mother died 6 years ago. You assumed control of the household. You assumed control of all the household accounts, including dormant ones, including one registered to a dead woman who left behind a baby and a loom. Lyra's composure held, but her hands, which had been resting on the table, moved slightly. A small adjustment, a repositioning, the kind of fidget that betrays the body's disagreement with the face's performance. You know what I find strange? Ilara continued. She was surprised by how steady her own voice was. She had expected to be angry. She was not angry. She was clear. The clarity felt like the moments before dawn, everything sharp-edged and waiting. I find it strange that you never mistreated me publicly. You never called me names. You never hit me. You were always careful, always indirect, always operating through systems and schedules and the natural hierarchies of the pack. Anyone looking from the outside would see a reasonable household manager making practical decisions about resource allocation. Omegas eat last. Night weavers work alone. The cold room is what is available. She leaned forward. That takes discipline. That takes planning. That is not the behavior of someone acting on impulse or cruelty. That is the behavior of someone who is building something, maintaining something, keeping a piece on the board in the exact position where it is most useful. Lyra was quiet. The lamplight caught her eyes, and Ilara saw something she did not expect. Not guilt, not defiance. Exhaustion. The bone-deep, spirit-deep exhaustion of a woman who has been holding too many things in the air for too long. My mother, Lyra said, and her voice was different now. Stripped of its lacquer, loved your mother. Did Maren tell you that probably not? My mother took in a pregnant stranger with no name, and no pack gave her a room, thus, and work, and protection, and loved her. And your mother died anyway. And my mother spent the next 14 years trying to forget it. She drank. She faded. She died. Lyra's jaw tightened. And I was left with a pack that was falling apart, a father who could not lead, and a kingdom full of wolves who smelled weakness the way sharks smell blood. The room was very still. The poison was not my idea, Lyra said. It was an arrangement, an alliance. There are forces that wanted the Alpha King dead, forces larger than Ashenmore, and they came to me because I was desperate and drowning, and they offered me a lifeline in exchange for access to the summit feast. She looked directly at Theron. I am not going to name them. Not because I am protecting them, but because they will kill my father and every wolf in this pack before your warriors reach their borders. And despite what you think of me, I do not want my pack destroyed. The silence that followed was thick and complicated. Theron uncrossed his arms. He walked to the table and placed both hands on its surface and leaned forward until his face was level with Lyra's. You used the identity of a dead woman to frame her daughter for your crime, he said. You spent 3 years starving and freezing my mate to keep her weak enough to be a convenient sacrifice. You conspired to assassinate the Alpha King at a peace summit. His voice was low, controlled, and terrible. Give me one reason not to execute you where you sit. Lyra held his gaze. Her hands were shaking now visibly, and she pressed them flat against the table to still them. Because if you execute me, my father collapses, this pack dissolves, and the forces I just mentioned walk in through the front door. I am the only thing holding Ashenmore together, and I have been holding it together since I was 16 years old, and I am so tired. Her voice cracked on the last word. Just once. Just barely. She recovered immediately, snapping the crack closed like a broken bone being set. Kill me if you want. But know what it costs. Elara watched Lyra's hands on the table. The trembling, the effort to control it, the white knuckles and bitten nails that no amount of jasmine perfume could disguise. She thought about what it meant to be 16 and responsible for an entire pack. She thought about cold rooms and reduced rations and the particular cruelty of someone who is themselves being crushed and passes the weight downward because there is nowhere else for it to go. She didn't forgive Lyra. She was not sure she ever would, but she understood her, and understanding was its own kind of violence, because it made things complicated when she wanted them to be simple. She lives, Elara said. Theron turned to look at her. She gives you the names. She cooperates with the investigation into whoever these forces are. And she lives, under watch, under restriction, but alive. She tried to kill me, Elara. Yes, and she told us why. And the why matters because the why leads to whoever is actually behind this, and you do not get to them by killing their pawn. Theron's amber eyes searched her face. She held his gaze. She held it with the steadiness of someone who has survived 20 years of being powerless and has learned that the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to be rushed. He straightened. Ronan. Confined quarters. Full guard. No visitors without my authorization. He looked at Lyra one more time. You will give us everything. Every name, every communication, every detail of every arrangement. And you will do it not because I am offering you mercy, but because she is. Lyra looked at Elara. For the first time, there was no calculation in her gaze, just something raw and unfinished that Elara did not want to examine too closely. They took her away. Elara stood and walked to the window and pressed her palms flat against the cold stone sill and breathed. Theron came up behind her. His hand found the small of her back, warm and solid, and she leaned into it before she could stop herself. You surprised me, he said. I surprised myself. Your wolf chose mercy. That is not the choice of a weak wolf. That is the choice of a wolf who is strong enough to hold back. She turned to face him. They were close now, closer than they had been, and the mate bond was a living thing between them, a current, a tide. She could feel his heart beat through his chest, steady and strong, nothing like the faltering rhythm she had felt through the castle walls 3 nights ago. Something is coming, she said. The forces Lyra mentioned. Whatever they are, they wanted you dead for a reason, and they are going to try again. Let them. Theron. Elara. He said her name the way he always said it, like it was the answer to a question he had been asking his entire life. I survived shadow venom because my mate wove me a cloth that pulled the poison from my blood. Whatever is coming, we face it. But not tonight. His hand moved from her back to her jaw, tilting her face up. Tonight, I need you to trust me with something. What? Your shift. She went cold. I cannot shift. I told you I do not have. You have a wolf. I can feel her. She is right there, just beneath the surface, and she has been trying to come through for days. She could not before, because she had nothing to come through for. No mate, no bond, no anchor. She has one now. And if it goes wrong, if she does not come, if I am just, then nothing changes. You are still my mate. You are still the woman who wove moonlight into silk and talked an alpha king out of an execution. You do not need a wolf to be what you are. She stared at him. The lamplight made his scars look like rivers on a map, tributaries of violence, flowing toward the delta of his jaw, his mouth the small scar on his lower lip that she had noticed the first night and wondered about. He was not a beautiful man in any conventional sense. He was something more difficult than beautiful. He was real. He was scarred and stubborn and alive and standing in front of her with his heart open like a door, and she could walk through it or she could turn away, and either way he would not lock it. She closed her eyes. The wolf came. It was not like the stories. It was not a graceful unfurling, a seamless melding of woman and animal. It was violent and messy, and it hurt. It hurt so badly that she screamed, her bones breaking and reforming, her skin splitting her spine, arching her vision, whiting out, and through it all his hands on her shoulders, holding her steady, his voice in her ear, saying her name over and over, an anchor in a sea of agony. And then it was done, and she was on the floor, and she was not Elara anymore. She was something else, something with 4 legs and white fur and eyes that saw the room in a spectrum of color she had never known existed, blues deeper than the ocean reds that pulsed like heartbeats, and every surface alive with scent. She could smell the stone and the oil lamps, and Lyra's lingering jasmine, and Ronan's leather and steel, and underneath everything him cedar and earth and river stone, her mate, her anchor, her home. Theron was on his knees in front of her. His face was wet. The Alpha King of Ironhold, feared by every pack on the continent, was kneeling on a cold stone floor, with tears running down his scarred face, looking at a white wolf who had spent 20 years trapped inside, a woman who did not know she existed. "There you are," he whispered. The wolf pressed her nose against his chest, against the place where the mating cloth had lain, and she felt his heartbeat, strong and steady, and hers. The attack came at dawn. They came through the eastern wall where the old masonry had been crumbling for decades, and the Ashenmoor guard was thinnest. 20 wolves moving in formation, sleek and fast and professionally coordinated. Not wild rogues, not a rival pack's blunt force assault. These were trained operatives, the kind of wolves who moved like shadows and killed without sound. Ronan's warning shout reached them seconds before the first explosion, a blast that took out the eastern gatehouse and sent a column of flame and debris into the pale morning sky. Elara was in Theron's chamber, still in wolf form, still learning the shape of her new body, and the shock wave knocked her off her feet and sent her sliding across the stone floor. Theron was already moving. He shifted as he ran, his human form dissolving into something massive and black and terrible, a wolf the size of a small horse, with eyes that burned amber in the smoke-filled corridor. He did not pause. He did not look back. He went through the door and into the chaos. Elara followed. The castle was a nightmare of smoke and screaming and the clash of bodies. Ashenmoor's defenders were disorganized, caught between sleep and combat, and the attackers moved through them with surgical precision, heading for a single target. They were not here to conquer the castle. They were here for Theron. The information Lyra had provided, hastily extracted over the past 48 hours, had painted a picture of a conspiracy that extended far beyond Ashenmoor's walls. A coalition of minor pack leaders who feared Ironhold's growing power, funded by an anonymous benefactor whose identity Lyra did not know or claimed not to know. The shadow venom had been the quiet option. This was the loud one. Elara ran through the smoke on white paws that she still did not entirely trust. Her wolf moved with an instinct and grace that her human body had never possessed, navigating the rubble, leaping over fallen beams, following the bond like a compass needle pointing toward Theron. She found him in the courtyard. He was surrounded. 8 wolves had cornered him against the base of the watchtower, and he was fighting with the savage efficiency of an alpha in his prime, but he was not in his prime. The shadow venom had left him diminished. His movements were a fraction slower than they should have been, his responses, a heartbeat delayed, and the attackers knew it. They were baiting him, drawing him out, wearing him down. She did not think. She did not plan. She ran. Her wolf hit the nearest attacker from the side, 120 pounds of white fury striking the grey wolf behind the ear and sending it tumbling across the cobblestones. The impact jarred her to the marrow. She had never fought in wolf form. She had never fought in any form. But the wolf knew what to do. The wolf had been waiting 20 years for this, and she fought with a ferocity that was entirely out of proportion to her size, tearing into the attackers with teeth and claws, and a sound that came from her throat without her permission, a howl, a roar, something between the two that echoed off the castle walls and made every wolf in the courtyard freeze. The mating cloth still draped across the back of the chair in Theron's chamber began to glow. They could not see it from the courtyard, but they felt it. Every wolf in the castle felt it, a pulse of warmth, a wave of energy rolling outward from the tower like a heartbeat, amplified through stone. The Ashenmoor wolves, who had been scattered and disorganized, suddenly snapped into focus, their eyes clearing their formation, tightening. The attacking wolves faltered, stumbled some of them, whimpering their aggression, dissolving like salt in water. Moonweaver. The old stories said the Moonweaver's cloth could do more than heal. It could bind. It could break bonds that were forced or corrupted. It could strip a false alpha of borrowed power and return a pack to its natural state. The attacking wolves were not fighting for a cause. They were fighting under compulsion. Their bonds manipulated their wills, subverted, and the cloth woven by a moonweaver's hands, with a mating pattern 400 years old, was unraveling those false bonds like thread pulled from a hem. One by one the attackers dropped. Not dead, not unconscious, released. They collapsed into their human forms, confused, disoriented, some of them weeping, all of them looking around with the dazed expressions of people waking from a dream they did not choose to enter. Theron shifted back. He was bleeding from a gash across his shoulder, another along his ribs, but he was standing. He looked at the fallen attackers. He looked at his warriors who were efficiently securing the perimeter. And he looked at Alara. She was standing in the center of the courtyard, a white wolf with silver-tipped fur and eyes that glowed like twin moons, and the air around her was shimmering with the residual energy of whatever she had done, whatever the cloth had done, whatever the Moonweaver's power had channeled through the bond and out into the world. She shifted back. It was easier the second time, less violent, more like stepping out of a coat. She was standing in the courtyard, in the thin nightdress she had been wearing when the explosion hit barefoot on cold cobblestones, her hair a white blonde tangle, her arms wrapped around herself against the dawn chill. "You just broke an alpha's compulsion bond on 20 wolves," Theron said. He was staring at her with an expression that was part awe, part disbelief, and part something she did not have a word for. Simultaneously. The cloth did it. The cloth is an amplifier. You are the source. He crossed to her and pulled her against his chest with his uninjured arm. She pressed her face into the hollow of his throat and breathed him in cedar and earth and blood and sweat and the sharp undertone of adrenaline, and she felt the bond settle between them like a river finding its bed. "They will come again," she said into his skin. "Yes. There will be more of them next time. Yes. I do not know how to control what I did. I do not know how to do it again on purpose. We will learn." together. He pulled back enough to look at her face. "Come home with me. Come to Ironhold. Not as my prize, not as my possession. As my mate, my equal, my queen. Come home with me, and let me spend the rest of my life making sure you are never cold, never hungry, never invisible again." The courtyard was full of wolves, Ironhold warriors cleaning up the aftermath. Ashenmoor wolves emerging from the castle with expressions that ranged from shell-shocked to cautiously hopeful, and among them she spotted Maren standing in the doorway, with her arthritic hands pressed to her mouth and tears streaming down her weathered face. "Maren comes with us," Ilara said. Theron looked at the old weaver. He looked back at Ilara. "Obviously. And the cloth, the funeral shroud, the mating cloth, whatever it is, it stays with me. It does not go to your council, or your war room, or your scholars for study. It is mine. I wove it. It is yours. And you will eat breakfast with me every morning, at the same table, not at the head while I sit below. Same table, same food, every morning." The corner of his mouth twitched. "You are negotiating the terms of a mating bond." "I am negotiating the terms of a life. I spent 20 years having no terms at all. I have some now." He looked at her, this thin, barefoot woman, standing in the wreckage of a battle she had ended, her hair wild, her feet bleeding from the cobblestones, her chin raised with the stubborn dignity of someone who has finally decided she is allowed to want things. And his face did something she had never seen an alpha's face do. It softened. Not collapsed, not weakened. Softened. The way a blade softens when you hold it to the forge, not to destroy it, but to reshape it into something better. "Name them all," he said. "I will agree to everyone." The mating ceremony took place 3 weeks later at Ironhold. It was nothing like the ceremonies Ilara had read about in the old books. There was no elaborate ritual, no procession, no chanting elders. Theron's pack gathered in the great hall of Ironhold Keep, a vast stone chamber heated by 4 hearths and lit by hundreds of beeswax candles that filled the air with the warm, sweet smell of honey. The walls were hung with banners bearing the Ironhold crest, a black wolf on a field of iron grey, and the long tables were laden with food that Ilara had helped prepare, because she wanted to. Because she had discovered that Ironhold's kitchens were run by a cheerful, competent woman named Bridget, who did not care about Omega status, and who had taught Ilara how to make a venison stew that could bring a grown warrior to tears. Maren sat at the front, wearing a new dress that she had complained about for 3 solid days, because the fabric was too fine for a working weaver, and Ilara had caught her stroking the sleeve when she thought no one was looking. Ronan stood at Theron's side, his scarred face set in its usual granite expression, though when Ilara took her place at the front of the hall, she saw his mouth curve just slightly, just for a moment, before the granite returned. Theron was wearing the mating cloth, not as a shroud, not as a cloak. He had asked the Ironhold leatherworker to fashion it into a mantle draped across his shoulders, clasped at the throat, with a silver pin shaped like 2 wolves circling each other. The mating spirals glowed in the candlelight, and the cloth seemed alive, warm, pulsing gently, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. Ilara wore white. She had woven the dress herself on a proper loom in a proper workshop with proper light and warmth and a fire that someone kept fed without being asked. The fabric was simple, unadorned, but when she moved it caught the candlelight with the same faint opalescence as the mating cloth, as if her hands could not help putting a piece of themselves into everything they made. The ceremony was brief. In Ironhold tradition, a mating was sealed with a mark, a bite on the junction of neck and shoulder, given and received permanent, visible, irrevocable. The alpha marked his mate, and his mate marked him because a bond, Theron had explained, is not a leash. It is a bridge. It goes both ways. He bit her first. His teeth on her skin were sharp and immediate, and the pain was bright and clean, and quickly replaced by a warmth that flooded through her body like sunlight filling a dark room. She felt the bond lock into place, felt it solidify from a thread into a chain, from a whisper into a voice, and the voice said, "Mine, hers, home." She bit him back. She had to stand on her toes to reach, and he bent his head for her, and she felt 100 pairs of eyes on them, and she didn't care. Her teeth found the junction of his neck and shoulder, and she bit down, and the sound he made was not pain. It was something she would remember for the rest of her life, a low, broken exhale, the sound of something that has been clenched for too long, finally letting go. The hall erupted. Not in polite applause, not in ceremonial chanting, but in the raw, full-throated howl of a pack welcoming its Luna. The sound hit her like a physical force, a wall of belonging, and for the first time in 20 years, Elara was not invisible. She was not tolerated. She was not the Omega Weaver in the cold tower room. She was seen and claimed and wanted, and the howl that rose from her own throat joined theirs, harmonized with theirs, became theirs. Theron pulled her against him and pressed his forehead to hers. His eyes were amber fire. His hands trembled just slightly, and she understood that the most powerful alpha on the continent was trembling because of her, because of a bond he had waited 32 years for, because of a woman who had tried to weave him a funeral shroud and had woven him a future instead. "My Luna," he said. "My king. My impossible, stubborn, negotiating, cloth-weaving mate. You forgot barefoot." He looked down. She was barefoot. She had removed her shoes before the ceremony, because the wolf in her preferred the feel of stone beneath her feet, solid and cold and real, and she had decided that her first act as Luna of Ironhold would be to stand on her own ground, in her own skin, without apology. He laughed. The Alpha King of Ironhold laughed, and it was not a polished sound, not a diplomatic chuckle, but a real laugh, rough and startled and genuine, and it echoed off the stone walls and made Ronan's granite face crack into an actual smile, and it was the best sound Elara had ever heard. The feast lasted until dawn. Elara ate venison stew and fresh bread with butter and roasted apples with cinnamon, and drank spiced wine that warmed her from the inside out. She sat at the high table in the Luna's chair, and Theron sat beside her, and their shoulders touched, and neither of them moved away. Maren drank too much wine, and told Brigid the kitchen matron the story of the funeral shroud 3 times with increasing embellishment, and by the third telling, the cloth had healed not just the Alpha King, but also 2 horses and an elderly goat. Brigid listened to all 3 versions with perfect patience, and then put the old weaver to bed in a warm room with thick blankets and a fire that would be kept fed all night. Outside, the first snow of the season was falling. Elara could see it through the great hall's windows, white flakes drifting down through the dark like scraps of unfinished cloth, and the sight of it made her think of her tower room in Ashenmoor, the cold and the dark and the endless weaving, and she was surprised to find that the memory didn't hurt. It was just a room. It was just a life she used to live. The thread had been cut, and the pattern had changed, and the cloth she was weaving now was warm and bright and hers. Later, in the quiet of their chamber, with the fire burning low and the snow falling silent outside the window, Theron traced the mating mark on her neck with his fingertip. "Tell me something," he said. "What, when you were weaving the shroud? When the pattern changed, what were you thinking about?" She was quiet for a moment, remembering. The cold tower room, the broken thread, the heartbeat she could feel through 3 floors of stone. "I was thinking that it was wrong," she said. "The morning pattern. The spirals going into the earth, returning to the moon. It was wrong, because you were not gone. You were right there, alive, fighting, and I was weaving you a goodbye, when what I should have been weaving was a beginning." His hand stilled on her neck. "So I stopped weaving what I was told to weave," she said, "and I started weaving what was true." He pulled her closer. The mating cloth lay across the foot of the bed, no longer glowing, just cloth now, just silk and moonlight, and a pattern that had not been woven in 400 years. It would glow again when it was needed. It would always glow when it was needed. That was the nature of a moon weaver's cloth, not a tool, not a weapon, but an extension of the truth of the wolf who made it. Elara pressed her face into Theron's chest and listened to his heartbeat. Strong, steady, hers. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the courtyard, the battlements, the road that led south toward Ashenmoor, where Lyra sat in her confined quarters, providing names and dates and details to Ironhold intelligence officers, where Gregor paced his study, trying to figure out how to rebuild a pack that had been rotting from the inside for years, where the eastern wall still bore the scorch marks from the explosion that had almost ended everything before it began. But here in this room, in this bed, in the warmth of a fire that someone would keep fed all night, a white-haired woman with silver in her eyes lay against the chest of a scarred king who wore her cloth like a crown, and their wolves settled together in the shared space behind their ribs, 2 shapes circling each other, forming a pattern with no beginning and no end. Her fingers twitched against his skin, the instinctive motion of a weaver whose hands never truly stop working. He caught her hand and held it still and pressed his mouth to her scarred knuckles. The snow kept falling.